I just wanted to kind of do a disclaimer and let you know that I'm not speaking now on behalf of the Government of Canada. I'm an independent researcher working part-time on my Ph.D. In Canadian Studies at Carleton University. I'm very inspired by a lot of the work that I'm doing, and that experience is feeding this analysis, which is ongoing. So the proposed focus of my dissertation is the intersection between homophobia, human rights, and international affairs. And for me, this is part of a broader continuum on my research. And as Ph.D. mentioned, I did publish in 2005 Pink Blood, Homophobic Violence in Canada, which is it was the first analysis of homophobia and transphobia as hate crimes in Canada that really looked at all of Canada. And it is in the U of T or U of O and Carleton libraries, I believe both in English and in French. So I was going to bring a copy, but I was carrying hand luggage onto the plane, so it was kind of heavy. So I wanted to talk today about the evolving nature of human rights. And before I forget, I do have a business card which is linked to George Washington University, where I'm also a visiting scholar in Washington. And I did pass around cards, so if anyone didn't get a card and wants one, then please feel free to grab one. It has my Gmail address on it, so it's an easy way to get a hold of me in case you have any questions about my research. So I wanted to sort of delve into how human rights discourse has evolved, especially since World War II. And interesting that most Western democracies now make human rights a central component of their foreign policies and their domestic policies. And what we find in developed countries is that they tend to devote significant resources towards the monitoring and analysis of human rights, both domestically and internationally. And so with this trend has also the concept of human rights has evolved from the rights of man, in quotation marks, to all these different groups now. If you look on the website, say, of the UN human rights system, and you look at all the special rapporteurs, they have special rapporteurs on the human rights of women, disabled people, human trafficking victims, victims of toxic waste, victims of mercenaries, victims of the war on terror. So these are all now being construed as human rights concerns. And I wanted to take one strand, which was LGBT. And before 1990, it was just never discussed in international fora, and certainly not using LGBT. It was gay and lesbian, or lesbian and gay was usually the term that was used. And yet today what we see is that there's now been this proliferation of discourse on LGBT issues, so that now even ministers, our Minister of Heads of State, the UN Secretary General are all now calling on states to do more to protect sexual minorities. Now this has entered also into what we would call generally mainstream human rights organizations such as Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch. Now LGBT is a very much a central, is now a component of the human rights that they monitor. And of course there have been, over the last 20 years, more specialized groups like the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, which are really linked to the efforts of the grassroots civil society organizations. So when it comes to human rights diplomacy, you do have the bilateral versus the multilateral human rights diplomacy. And I want to actually focus more on the multilateral and just to sort of just a very quick overview, there are many multilateral organizations that now include human rights discourse and LGBT rights in their discussions. Not just the UN and the Organization of American States, but also the African Union, the European Union, the Commonwealth, the Francophonie. So this is now entering into the discourse. And what I call it a triangular dynamic between, it's the interaction of three distinct actors. You have the diplomats at these multilateral missions, you have the international organizations and the secretariats of these missions, and then you have civil society. And all those three components are it's a very dynamic situation where one is feeding into the other, which is feeding into the other. So it's an exciting environment to be working in. I don't want to focus on the UN human rights system because it is huge, but just to quickly give an overview, you have the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Novanathan Pillay, and one of the breakthroughs in the LGBT issues in the UN human rights system was this resolution on LGBT rights that took place at the Human Rights Council on July 14th. 2011, and it was called Human Rights, Sexual Orientation, and Gender Identity. So I'm showing this as this was a sort of a turning point for global discourse on LGBT issues. It was the first of its kind. It passed 23 to 19, and you'll see on that list the countries that were in favor and the countries that were against this resolution. And there were 3 abstentions. And I think when you look at that list, you can sort of draw some of your own conclusions, or maybe make some generalizations about the types of what some of the patterns are, I'll say. So and since we are going to be focusing on Latin America, what's interesting is you don't see any Latin American countries that voted against this resolution. They all voted in favor of it. And granted, it's not scientific because the Human Rights Council, of course, only has a certain percentage of all the UN member states at any given time, but it's clear that they're often reflecting many of the attitudes of their neighbors. And so what we've seen over the last few years in Latin America has been a complete dynamic change in LGBT rights. It was interesting because I was at a conference in Washington at American University last May. It was the LASA conference on Latin American Studies, and there was a special discussion on Latin American LGBT rights. And the feminists were saying, isn't it interesting that we've had more progress discussing LGBT rights and changing those laws in Latin America than we have on, say, abortion rights and reproductive rights in Latin America. So it's this ironic and interesting twist that an area that 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, there were many stereotypes in Latin America about the relative homophobia in the society and the intolerance. And what we can see is a real change in that perspective. The UN report was also a turning point because so what this UN resolution did is it requested a report to come out. And this report, which was issued on November 17th, 2011, really was the groundbreaking, covering all the territory of where the discrimination takes place. So in the first section, it talks about the various international instruments which should be protecting LGBT rights, but is not very often. The second was really more of a graphic depiction of the types of violence that take place in various regions around the world. Section 3 was on the discriminatory laws, including 76 countries that still criminalize same-sex activity, including 5 with the death penalty, and Section 4 on various discriminatory practices. Now, another part of the important part of the UN system is the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review, which I'm sure many of you are studying, and to me it's just such a rich area for discourse to study, because everything is out there on the table, and you have the transcripts of these discussions, and it's a peer review mechanism, so every 4 months there's a new group of countries that are being evaluated by other countries. And when you go in there and look at the transcripts, it's very interesting how many questions about LGBT rights are being discussed on the world stage right now. So although people criticize the UN human rights system, one great contribution is that it's putting the words out there. So for example, on April 29th of last year, the UK asked Russia, what is the government of Russia doing to ensure the protection of the rights of LGBT people, including, etc., with reference to the homosexual propaganda law. So the effect of this is to get they may not get answers, and the answers may not be very clear, but at least they're getting the questions out. So now I want to move to the inter-American human rights system, and in 1948, the Charter of the Organization of American States was signed, and that led to the establishment of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, which is based in Washington, in '59. And in '61, the commission started doing their first on-site visits to investigate human rights issues in the Americas. And so this grew into a regional human rights instrument called the American Convention on Human Rights, which came into force in 1978, and 23 OAS member states are parties to that convention, not Canada and the United States, or quite a few of the English-speaking Caribbean countries. And what it does is it also essentially created the Inter-American Court of Human Rights based in Costa Rica. And so for the 23 member states of the hemisphere that have signed the convention and recognized the court, then the complaints that come from the commission move up the system, and if the state does not comply with those human rights issues, it can be moved up to the court level. So just to give you a little snapshot of what is being done in terms of LGBT human rights in the Inter-American system, there are basically 4 ways that the Inter-American system has raised awareness of LGBT rights. One is on the political level through resolutions that have been adopted at the annual OAS General Assembly, which takes place every year in a different city in the Americas. One is through the work of the commission, one is through the work of the court, and one is through other inter-American organizations. So I wanted to just take you through, if we have enough time, some of the ways that the LGBT issue has been engaged in the inter-American human rights system. So for example, resolutions on sexual orientation and gender identity have been adopted every year. And so this was the one, for example, from 2013. And so what it does is it's interesting to see from 2008 to 2013 how that annual resolution has gotten beefed up and changed over time. So in 2008, it was very generic and said, basically one page talking about, calling on the states to discuss and to be concerned about acts of violence and related human rights violations. And if you see, it's fascinating to see that same resolution year after year, which is all online on the OAS website. And by 2013, you have a very different, it's taking note of a unit that's been developed at the commission. It describes sex assignment surgery as torture. It condemns all forms of discrimination and gets into political issues and calls for states to produce data on homophobic and transphobic violence. And by the end, it was very interesting because last June, there was no longer a consensus. And so it had created, it had started as a more of a goodwill, not goodwill, I don't know what the word I'm saying, but it was a very neutrally worded, carefully worded resolution 5 years ago. And by now, you could see the divisions splitting. So if you go to the footnote and read carefully the footnotes of the 2013 sexual orientation OAS resolution, you see Jamaica and Guyana and lots of countries in the Caribbean that are sort of taking exception to some of the wording. And so what we're seeing here is a split in the hemisphere in terms of political issues and who is supporting what and who is taking which side. And I mean, obviously, much of that is related to the fact that there are 11 countries in the English-speaking Caribbean that criminalize homosexual behavior. So it did create a bit of a split. I just wanted to talk quickly about what the Commission has been doing on LGBT rights. They've had 22 hearings over the last 5 or 10 years on LGBT issues. Some have been country-specific, Guatemala or Haiti or Venezuela. There's been regional discussions and workshops and presentations on LGBT issues and homophobia and violence in the Caribbean, in Central America, as well as themes, thematic, indigenous, lesbian, intersex, prison, civil unions, and transgender. And I would recommend that you go to the sessions link of the IACHR website. It's iachr.org. It's in Spanish and English. And if you click on sessions, it will go to webcasts of all the sessions, the hundreds of sessions that have taken place over the last several years. And you can even go to a link on LGBT issues, which then clarifies the link to certain webcasts and certain hearings that have been LGBT specific. There have also been press releases, so the Commission is very good at monitoring and putting out press releases on the latest violence against LGBT people in the hemisphere. So you get a good read on that. Embedded within the annual reports of the Commission, you also have what you see is increasingly larger and more detailed sections on LGBT issues. Now, the country reports, there was a really good one on Jamaica that came out a year ago, and it has a whole chapter on LGBT issues, which this is all free and accessible on the IACHR website, so I would recommend going to that. Also, precautionary measures, which is kind of a legalistic term, which is kind of used. They can come in if they want. Precautionary measures are kind of like injunctions or what's the word? Orders, temporary orders to order the state to protect people that are under risk, so risky situations. So they have done this 9 times over the last, since 2003, where they've actually issued precautionary measures to activist LGBT leaders in the Americas to protect them for their work who've been receiving death threats. There have been educational seminars that have taken place throughout the hemisphere on various topics. And there's also been individual petitions which have led to important decisions. So on topics such as pensions, prison visits, estate law, HIV status, invasion of privacy, and expulsion from the military. So you have to remember that these are often countries that are in the convention, which means that the state is required to go to a hearing and to listen to the concerns of the NGOs that are and lawyers that are defending the victims, and they have to come up with a solution. And if they don't, there is the threat that that could be moved to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and I don't think any Latin American country wants that. So they take it very seriously, and I wanted to just talk about one of those LGBT cases that did go to the court, and it's the case of Karen Atala in Chile. So this has so far been the only LGBT commission case that has moved up to that level. And it's considered by many, the decision Atala, Rifo, and Daughters versus Chile at the Court of Human Rights is considered by many to be a breakthrough for LGBT rights in the Americas. So Karen Atala was a Chilean lawyer and judge. She was married with 3 daughters. And in 2002, she separated from her husband. She took custody of her daughters. And after her husband moved out, her girlfriend moved in. And the father sued her for custody of the children, claiming that her homosexuality could endanger the children and expose them to sexually transmitted diseases. And because she was a judge, so she knew the law. But she was also very vulnerable in that situation. And so the lawsuit led to media coverage across Chile on this topic. It was really sensationalized. Her workplace in the court, they did a judicial investigation of her, alleging that she was unfit to be a judge. And this went all the way to the Supreme Court of Chile in 2004, which found that her daughters were at risk because she was a lesbian, and sided with the father and awarded him custody. So this was, I'm not going to get into the mechanics of the commission, but the idea behind the commission is that you have to exhaust your last remedy in your country before it can be forwarded to the commission, to the court. And so that's about as far as you can go in Chile as the Supreme Court. So she then submitted a complaint to the commission. That's the report number that can be checked. And basically, in the complaint, her lawyers argued that homosexuality cannot be considered a just cause for declaring her unfit as a mother. That led to a decision. The court, the commission concluded that Chile was responsible for the discrimination against Karen Atala and her daughters. And so what the commission does at that point is it tries to work out something with the state. So there was a mediation process that took about a year, I think, and they could not come to a conclusion. So they couldn't come to a good mediation, and so the commission said, okay, we're sending this to the court. So they don't do it automatically. They're trying to get buy-in to the goodwill of the state to change laws, to indicate that they are going to make a change, and they would not. So what happened was it got sent to the court. And so finally what happened was the decision of the court in February 2012, the caso Atala, Rifo y Niñez versus Chile, sentencia de 24 de febrero de 2012. Basically, the 6 judges were unanimous in their view that Chile had violated her rights. The justice ordered up by the court was both concrete and symbolic. Not only was Chile ordered to pay her $50,000 in damages, but also to pay medical costs for psychotherapy that had been incurred by the victims over the years, and to provide 4 more years of psychotherapy to the victims. And the court ordered Chile to implement permanent anti-homophobia training for judicial officials across the country. And in December 2012, the Chilean Justice Minister publicly apologized to Atala. And in its decision, but it wasn't just, it was, the state was motivated to do that because in the actual sentence, in the judgment, the Court of Human Rights stipulated that the ceremony be attended not only by, it had to be state officials at the highest level, and it also had to be attended by NGOs, support groups, women's groups who had supported the victims over the years. So there was both the concrete and the symbolic. And then my last slide is just saying that that potentially has a ripple effect because within months of the Atala decision, the Supreme Court of Mexico cited Atala after striking down a law in the state of Oaxaca that prohibited same-sex marriage. So you can see how this inter-American jurisprudence is something that is certainly paid attention to by other states and can potentially have an impact. So I thought it would be nice to leave on a positive note and finish on that as a kind of a way of summing up that I think there is hope for change and that change is actually happening. And I would be interested in hearing your perspectives. So thank you.